Nice to see you. You gotta play the game. We have to play the game.
Longer discussion.
You don't have anybody around you anyway.
What's that? No crack? One in the middle also? What did they change? Did they change that?
Don't you have a railroad mask?
Welder's mask or?
You need a railroad mask with a big train coming out
Yeah, I hope that goes as well.
like that.
People read that screen as it here.
Oh, yeah. Everything good?
Yeah, I want to see what's going on, you know?
Good for you. Won't learn about it any other way.
True.
Tomorrow will be more pleasant. Hey, he's gonna take all the bullets.
Oh. True story.
What did Sue say? He's gonna take all the bullets.
Seven? I'm not following. Okay. Should be here 1 second, then we get started.
Mark Davis, he's here.
Put down the remote control, Mark. Yeah.
Yes, hello, everybody.
Is that the line? I don't see her. Oh.
Set them with the crane and stuff like that. They're pretty good.
I just sent the email a minute ago to, again, just another email.
Okay, okay.
To join.
Sometimes they text me. I don't have any text.
Yeah, I don't.
Yes. Oh,
that's pretty cool. Out of curiosity.
All right, thanks.
There's Cliff.
Good.
Down to Roy.
No, we're fine. I need. Okay, I'd like to call the meeting of the Kane County CARES Act Allocation Committee to order. It's 2:03, and I'll ask the clerk to call the roll.
Hanson,
Here.
Kenyon,
Here,
Ross,
Here.
Sanchez, Surges,
Here.
Thomas, and Hoshet. You have a quorum?
All right, just for information, I note that Mr. Caius, Mr. Davis, Mr. Leonard, Ms. Allen, Mr. Shefflow, Ms. Sterrett, Ms. Barrero are joining us by teleconference. So welcome. Thank you, everyone, for being here today. The first item of business on today's agenda is the approval of the task force minutes of July 1 and our minutes of July 6th. Moved by Mr. Frost, second by Mr. Kenyon. Any discussion on the minutes? Hearing none, all those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Opposed?
we have to do a roll call, don't we?
Oh, all right, yeah, for purposes
Got
of,
lawyers here, you could be in
Right.
trouble.
we're asking for roll call votes, even though voice vote is typical for this type of motion. Clerk, please call the roll.
Hanson,
Yes.
Kenyon,
Yes,
Frost, Sanchez,
Yes.
Surges,
Yes.
and then Thomas is absent. Okay, and Hoshet?
Yes. Minutes are approved. All right, first item of, or next item of business on the agenda is public comment. Is there anyone in the audience that would like to address the committee this afternoon? Hearing none, is there anyone on the Zoom conference that would like to address the committee in the public? Okay, hearing none, we'll move on to our discussion items. The agenda that we established for this meeting is really consistent with last week's meeting. And the purpose, of course, is to try to move forward in our process of sorting through the county's duty to allocate the funds that have come to us under the CARES Act. I do have some feedback. Last week, we talked about these issues, came up with certain consensuses on some items, and then had action items that we needed to follow up on. And what I'd like to do is go through these and provide feedback and gain additional comments from the committee and the board members who are participating so that we can wrap up some of these items so the process could move forward. What I'd like to do first is move item H to the top of the agenda, because I think this issue, if we have some understanding as to where we're going with this issue, it'll help us with some of the other issues we're going to discuss. Throughout this process, there's policy issues that need to be made, specifically allocation of funds, approving of funds for certain types of uses. But there's also a documentation process, and I guess in banking terms is called the backroom process, where we have to have forms and prepared. We have to make sure the I's are dotted and T's are crossed as funds are going to be released. Certain documentation regarding the allocation of funds that would be needed to be maintained, particularly because of the stringent audit standards that come with the responsibility for being an agency that is in charge of and disbursement of the funds. And so one of the things we had talked about, for example, last week, which we'll touch on in a minute, is having a formal application in place, having an intergovernmental agreement to deal with distributions to what we'll call subrecipients, municipalities in this case, and having certain other details maintained. The current staff of the county is busy doing other things, and to drop this into their lap with a request to take over our job with this project probably would be short-sighted. I know that, however, we do have to have someone here, or we have to have an understanding as to how the process is going to be working, who's going to oversee it. And with respect to that scenario, it is permissible to expend some of the funds from this grant program or this CARES Act to our cost of administering the program. And that's consistent with what we do with the riverboat grants and the community development block grant funds that we get. But initially, I considered, we talked about last meeting, Scott Berger, we talked about Joe Onzig's office, and the feedback that I received, at least initially from those offices, was that they were, although they're willing to help, they're busy and putting this in their lap would be a challenge. So I don't want to create undue stress for anyone and create a situation where we can't be aggressive in moving forward with the program, which is what I understand the will of the county board to be. So I discussed this with other in-house, what I'll call in-house individuals who could help. Although Scott has indicated Berger a willingness to help with the process, he just is burdened with the other grant programs that are going on. And I know Joe Onzig just got done with the audit, and now he's onto the budget for next year. Obviously, he's a resource for information, but to assign this to him would probably be unfair at this point. So given the fact that we were dwelling with a lot of compliance issue and a lot of technical legal issues, my suggestion is that we have the state's attorney's office be the party that would be the overseer for the program from our standpoint. And that means that they would be hands-on in terms of being the entity to which applications would be submitted. They could assist vetting those with help from the auditor's office to the extent it was necessary. I talked to State's Attorney McMahon. He indicated a willingness to participate and assist us. He's an independent elected official, so I think that's another benefit for having his office do that. And of course, his least observation, having been on the board for a number of years, is that he has a good working relationship with the other offices and departments in the county and can work with them as needed. So I want to open up that concept for discussion to start with and see if the committee has any feedback on that. Mr. Frost?
It's also my understanding, hearing some of the discussion behind the scenes that the state's attorney's office does because of the workload at the government center, right, or at the judicial center right now. They have some staff time available and funds available to handle the project. So as I understand it, this is something that you could easily take on, or maybe easily isn't the best word, but
That's the only word I would quarrel with is easily.
Okay.
It's a big undertaking, but we do have some ability to assist, and we'll do whatever we can to streamline this process. I understand the urgency of the issue that's before this commission and the full board. It may be that we have to go out and bring in some outside assistance as well. And as you know, there is a line item in the state's attorney's budget that allows for contractual services, and I've got some room given the balance of the fiscal year where I could tap into that source of funds. Yes.
thank you.
One thing Mr. McMahon pointed out to me, which I thought was interesting and valuable, is that to the extent he has not expended the funds that are in his current budget for outside resources, those could be used as opposed to using the CARES Act funds. Now, to the extent we needed additional personnel beyond that, we could pay with the CARES Act, but that could be an additional benefit of this process.
Right.
Any other feedback, Mr. Surgis?
My question would be, with the neighboring counties that have all received the same funds, who are they using, and is there a synergy that we can create? There's a part of me, John, that believes if we had an outside firm that was assisting, do they not then share some of the liability that we might be taking on if something doesn't fit or wouldn't have been expended? And are we looking to those other counties to say, what are y'all doing and why are we trying to recreate the wheel? Or are we doing exactly what they're doing and not a big deal? And is Mr. McMahon's point to say, sure, we'll work with whoever that group is? Or is he saying, no, we got the whole thing? Just help me understand that a little bit.
A little of both, Mr. Sturgis. So we have already been in contact with neighboring counties on their application process, their intergovernmental agreement to try to kind of pool resources and information. So we've looked at their application. We've conferenced with them about their process. So we've already done that aspect. But if there is kind of an outside expert that some of these other counties have retained to assist with this process, I mean, it could be that we retain the same expert to kind of take
Seems to me if we
advantage.
hunt as a pack on this one, that's probably smarter than being the lone wolf.
Right.
And that's so unlike me to say, but in this particular case, I think there's,
Yeah, I don't see this as being a lone wolf. And one of the benefits of being behind the other counties from a timing perspective is we have the ability to learn and share information with them to see what they've done. But each county has a point person that is in charge of dealing with the outside world in terms of that. And we have to identify someone here that will do that. And so that's the starting point for the process. And that's the reason that I'm recommending that we use the state's attorney's office as that party.
again, if there's an outside intelligence or a consulting firm or whomever, I would strongly recommend we swim together, stay in the wake. So,
Fully agree with you.
okay.
Mr. Kenyon?
I think it's an excellent idea, and his willingness, the state's attorney's willingness to participate is the key to the situation. And I trust his judgment of your office. You will seek what counsel you need.
Thank you.
Comments at this point, Mr. Sanchez?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Yeah, I just wanted to say, I think it's a really good use of county resources, coming together, different departments, different branches of government. So I'm in favor of the idea.
I think the important thing to point out is if our inclination is to go in this direction, this isn't being done to the exclusion of the other elected officials or department heads. In fact, it's collaborative input that's going to be needed. But the person requesting that information on our behalf will be the state's attorney's office and trying to coordinate everything to get back to us. All right, so I guess what I'll do is take a consensus of the committee that that's the direction they want to go. Does any committee member have an objection to moving forward on that basis? Hearing none, I just want to thank State's Attorney McMahon for being available at odd hours to have discussions about this process and his willingness to assist. All right, with that background, then we can go through in chronological order. First item that we talked about last week was the status of the funds and the availability of funds for current distribution. We know that the funds are here in our treasury. The only one footnote I wanted to add to that this month, and I think this is something with Treasurer Rickert being here this afternoon, I appreciate your being here, is information about the earnings on the funds, because it's my understanding that those earnings by part of the, or pursuant to the provisions in the CARES Act allocation, that those funds get added to the available funds and are to be used for the same purposes that that we are using the funds that were transferred to us for. So Dave, I'm not trying to put you on the spot, but to the extent that you could keep us in the loop on that going forward as we meet, because ultimately we're going to be making decisions regarding distribution of the entire fund, and we'll need to know those numbers. That'd be great.
Yeah, funds were transferred in. They were just overnight deposited at First American Bank in an overnight account, earning 5 basis points. That was quickly transferred the next day to a account, what we'd call a super fund, earning 0.45 basis points, which doesn't sound like a lot, but in this current market, economic market, and the fact that those funds will be dispersed, we're assuming by year end all those funds will be gone. There's not a lot of investment options we have beyond that, so that's the current status. I can at a future meeting, if you want exact numbers as far as what interest has been earned so far, we can supply that at your next meeting, if that's the will of the committee.
That'd be great if you would. I appreciate that. That's just again, an accounting issue we need to deal with on an ongoing basis. And although that interest rate is historically generally low, it's substantial when you're dealing with $90+ million. So it can certainly help us defer some of our administrative costs, if not add to the principal balance of the fund.
Okay, thank
All
you.
right, thank you. Any questions regarding the status of the funds? I don't think anything else has changed since we met last week. All right, permissible recipients. We had talked last week about identifying the population of permissible recipients. We acknowledged through the efforts of the mayors that the city certainly, as it relates to their Kane County population, are individuals who would, or entities that would be able to participate and whose applications we would expect to receive. But we also agreed to include a couple different types of municipal entities. One was the Forest Preserve District, the second was the Park Districts, and then the third was fire protection districts, to the extent that they had unincorporated territory. Now, let me cover that last concept first, because I think we need to come to an agreement. In discussing this with the committee members, I don't think anyone has any objection to the fire protection districts receiving reimbursement for their COVID-related expenses, that to the extent they meet the criteria for the program. The question is, who is the correct applicant for the fire protection district? So we have certain municipalities in the county who have their own fire department and don't serve any unincorporated areas. And then we have some that are completely rural in the unincorporated areas. And then a number who are in between, like the city of Batavia, for example. I discussed this with Mayor Schilke before our meeting. The city of Batavia covers, of course, the city of Batavia, but they also cover a number of areas that are outside the city. And so the important thing, and this is really a mathematical computation, is to get it right. So if we ask the municipalities to include in their application the request for their fire protection districts to the extent that they are covering the area within the city, and then allow those same districts to request funding from the unincorporated area, that would be one way to do it, and based on a breakdown of population figures. And so I just want, the other option would be to take the fire protection districts out of the applications for the municipalities and have them apply on their own. Either way would work. I think because we have a number of cities that have their own fire departments, maybe just be easier for them to include those in their applications. So if we could do it in the hybrid way, I just want to open up that discussion so we can give direction. Mr. Frost?
Yeah, and another example would be in my district, you have the village of Elburn. You have the Elburn Fire Protection District, which is one of the largest in the state by area. And within that district is the village of Elburn, the village of Maple Park, village of Caneville, Lily Lake, I believe, is in there too. So IT department has, our GIS department under IT has already undertaken looking at the areas of the various fire districts. So we would have the option of asking if the municipal grants that are given out to cover their square mile or their population counts within their municipal limits. And then the county would cover the rural areas.
I don't think I think that we just want to get it right. And there's two different ways of accomplishing the same thing. As long as we have cooperation from all of the participating parties, it'll require some math and calculations, but if no one objects to moving forward on that basis, I think we can do that. Separately, I did request from Mark Armstrong after our last meeting a list of the taxing bodies that the park districts, for example, and some of the other entities, and he did provide me a list of those which show up on our tax bills. So I think in fairness, if we're going to go through an application process, we should direct whoever our clerical staff is in this process to send out a notice to these entities saying that we're undertaking this process. Or we're going to have a time frame for at least an initial time frame for submitting applications so that no one can say they were left out in the process. Does anyone have an objection to that? All right, hearing none. Again, that's technical information that, that we can get. As we talked about last week, DuPage County set aside $1 million for those Park District type entities. I think that was in part due to the fact that the incremental expenses from those entities tended to be more modest compared to the police and fire based entities like our cities. So hopefully when we get their applications, we can vet those and see where we're at. Mr. Hanson?
Thank you. Just for clarity, curious what the will of our committee is regarding where the set aside amount would come from. Would that be part of the potential trough of money for municipalities, or would that come from the county allocation? I personally believe that whether it be the preserve or the park districts benefit the region and beyond the borders of that taxing area. So I think it should come from the county portion. But that's my personal belief.
Any other discussion? I think given an approach that we may be taking, I'm not sure that decision has to be made today, Matt, but it's something to certainly consider. We're going to have to fine tune this. It may be better understood or evaluated once we get applications in to make a determination. But like I say, if it's substantially greater than I'm anticipating, then it may take on a different character, or we may limit the amount that would go to those entities. Barb?
Thank you, John. Under permissible recipients, I didn't hear anything about unincorporated areas or the townships.
Well, under the municipal recipients, one of the components of municipal recipients is actually the unincorporated areas. And in terms of rough numbers, based on the math that was done out of the task force, the amount allocated to the unincorporated areas was roughly $7 million. All right, so we had discussed last meeting that we would put the responsibility for applying and sorting out the appropriate recipients or recommending the appropriate recipients for that component of the fund to the development committee. And so that would be discussed there.
Okay.
Yeah, it's important that we understand that going in.
Mhm.
Right. All right, Ms. Thomas.
I'm just curious, how many park districts are we talking about, and would consideration funding for those entities begin in the development committee as well?
Well, the second question first, I think we would get applications for those entities to see what their costs are, and then we would make a determination as to where the funds would come from, what the will of the board would be. I've got a list here. Obviously, in the south end of the county, Fox Valley is a large park district, but Geneva, Batavia, St. Charles has park districts. Elgin has a parks department. South Elgin has a park district. Dundee Township has a park district. Hampshire has a park district. Huntley does for their portion in Kane County. Bartlett has a small area of their park district in our county, but it's very nominal. If I forgot one or two, I believe this is off the list that Mr. Armstrong had given me.
South Elgin's is controlled by the village.
By
They
the
don't have a
village.
district,
Different,
no
okay.
separate taxing.
Okay. So moving on to the next item, application and process and timeframe. We had at our last meeting discussed preparing a formal application, and this, I'm going to lump this together with item F, which is the intergovernmental agreements and the indemnity agreements. Because this was a substantial legal issue, I had discussions with the state's attorney's office to help formulate an intergovernmental agreement using the resources that we had in-house and also using our neighboring counties as resources as well, because they had their agreements in place already. I also requested that because the intergovernmental agreement and application were really intertwined, that the state's attorney's office work on that as well. And so What we have today are drafts of those potential documents. Obviously, I haven't read this cover to cover yet. I'm not going to hand this to this committee and say it's appropriate for recommendation. But what I want to do is at least have this available. Hard copies are here for everyone to pick up before they leave. But what I'd like to do is have everyone look at this. I will direct the state's attorney to send it out to the entire county board so that not only committee members here, but the other board members who are participating or interested can read through them. County staff can look at them, the elected officials can look at them, so we can get something in place so that once we make a decision to move on with the funding, we have this approved. Now, at least initially, I suggested that this committee would be meeting often. I would suggest that it would be appropriate, given my anticipated the action that I would expect is going to happen tomorrow at the board, that we have an application in place sooner rather than later. So I'd like to distribute this to the committee, and then maybe by the time we have our next committee meeting, which would be within a week or so, we have a final approved application from this committee. Does anyone object to that? I know you can see these are fairly detailed. There are actually 3 documents here. One is the funding guidance, the second is an application, and the third is the intergovernmental agreement. So this wasn't prepared overnight. It took substantial work. So I would ask everyone to put the time in to read it. It may raise questions that you didn't know about, but the purpose is to put all the cards on the table so we have this able to move forward. Any other comments on that process, Mr. Hanson?
Thank you. As we review these, it'll be a little too legal for most of us, but back in the spirit of wolf pack or flying solo or hunting solo, are these IGAs and these applications unique to Kane County? Are they going to mirror, be similar to those of our surrounding counties and other entities here in the state?
So they're unique to Kane County, but we did meet with both DuPage County and Cook County. Cook County has really a completed application and intergovernmental agreement that I believe is publicly available, but we obtained it directly from Cook County. And then we conferenced with DuPage County and the DuPage County State's Attorney's Office to work together. And what is in front of you, and I want to caution, it's a draft, so I'm soliciting inputs. There's some additional certifications that I think need to be included that are not included in what's in front of you. But what is in front of you is a consolidation of those meetings that we had with Cook and DuPage, and then my own staff here in Kane County.
Okay, thank you. And then regarding, I know it's a different agenda item, but the census data or the certification, where is the certification sign off, if you will, or approval from each applicant? Where is that built into the process?
So it will be built into the application in paragraph 5. It is not included in the copy that's in front of you, but it is, as Chairman Hoscheit indicated, this has been a lot of work that's already gone into this, and it's in a working draft that is on my desk, but just wasn't prepared in time to include in front of you today. But that will be included in the application, paragraph 5.
Thank you. I was just curious if it was going to be standalone, but if it's part of the application process, then that's really what I was looking for. All right, thank you.
At one point, I just want to make, some of the board members I discussed about the application process, commented that we don't want to make it too complicated. We are partners with our local municipalities. Let's make this as easy as possible. But given the technical federal requirements, what otherwise would seem something easy to do is more complicated, and hence we have a stack of papers instead of a couple pages of applications. So keep that in mind when you're reading it. If you're frustrated by the complexity of it, it's for a good reason. All right. Methodology of allocation. We talked about this last week, and this really covers a couple of different issues. One was the concept of 55-45 split of funds. I think that was discussed at the executive committee and Last week at our committee, the consensus was that that was an appropriate allocation of resources. We did that in part because that was the number that the state used. I think that was the original consensus of or basis for that. But we also did it with the understanding that we wanted to reserve enough funds to deal with county needs as well. And I think the consensus was at least that that was appropriate. So what I'd like to do, and we do need to cover a few more details here, but at the end of this meeting, with the hope that we'll pass something on tomorrow in the form of a resolution that gets what I'll hope for fairly unanimous consent, is that at least the concept of the 45 to municipal applicants and the 55% to the county is something that the committee is willing to work with. When we met last week and had an agreement on that consensus, we didn't have information that we already have now that we've obtained since then. We had presentations at the executive committee for some of the internal needs that we have for projects that we could fund. Mr. Onzik provided some financial information to us that talked about other permissible uses of the funds, or so we're developing a better understanding as to where we're at. But certainly the municipalities have needs, and we've taken on the responsibility to deal with their allocation. So I guess what I want to know from this committee is there anyone have a different concept in mind, or are we still comfortable with 45% being allocated to the municipalities at this point? Mr. Surgis?
I remain committed to having a contingency built in there, just to see, because we don't know what we don't know. If that contingency, I've been putting forward a 10% number out there to be withheld from both groups. If come November, October, those funds haven't been used, 55-45 of what that contingency is, and get it out.
But you're agreeing with the 55-45 split. All right.
Little confused with the townships and the fire thing and where that's coming from. I've listened to that discussion, and I've yet to, in my head, understand is that which 55 or 45, which split are you suggesting that comes from? So while I'm saying,
I think
absolutely, I don't quite understand
the fire
that.
districts would come from the 45%, clearly, because to the extent they're included in the municipal applications, they would be funded through that, and the unincorporated fire protection districts would be funded through the unincorporated allocation of the 45%.
Perfect.
Mr. Chairman?
Okay, that would be helpful. The terminology, I believe, is confusing folks. The municipalities, if in the past it's been referred to as all local governments, and
I think those terms in the Illinois compiled statutes are synonymous, but if you prefer that I use a different
well, only for
term,
the
I'll be
lay
glad to
people.
use it.
You know, for those of us who are not as familiar as you are with the Illinois statutes, and the people who, you know, whose money this actually is that's getting distributed, I think it'll be clearer to refer to it. It also becomes clearer when it comes to the issue that I believe that Mr. Hansen has one point of view on it. Some of the other members of the CAAC committee have a different point of view. Right. So I understand that what is being said is the 45% is all local governments. Thanks, John.
All right, the next item was the issue of census. And I know that issue is one, I consider this similar to the fire protection district issue. It's not an issue of whether we're going to use census as population as an allocation method. It's what's the right census count. And so there was a number that the task force used as a working number. Then there was some question about that number. And then Mark Armstrong came to a meeting and presented different figures, and there was some objection to that. So Mark in his concluding comments suggested we use the CMAP figures, which were obtained after last meeting. And I was provided copies of those. At the same time, I requested clarification as to not just the population of the city, but also the Kane County population. And also asked if the municipalities themselves agreed unanimously that the CMAP numbers were accurate, okay, because that was important to us. I think with, with Mr. Armstrong's figures, the city of Aurora had objections. With the CMAP figures, there were a number of what I'll call slight objections, and then one more substantive objection. I believe the city of Elgin has a concern about their numbers. And then the other municipalities, and these will, I'll consider these minor when I say this, it's, you know, a few hundred one way or the other, which could have been caused by recent growth and is probably pretty easily demonstrated by building permits and new populations. But the villages and entities that raised questions were and this is just in alphabetical order: Campton Hills, Carpentersville, Maple Park, Montgomery, and St. Charles. And so when we look at their numbers, actually 3 of them gave us numbers that they thought it should be, so we can actually calculate the difference between what we had calculated and what they're saying is their actual number. The others are going to require a little bit more evaluation, but I think we discussed before going out to an outside source, trying to count heads, which is impractical given the time frame we have to do this within. So an option that I think may be practical is, because the overwhelming majority of the local governmental entities that we have population counts for have agreed with the CMAP figures, and we would incorporate that certification into the application process, that we use this as a basis, but then we allow for those who have questions about the numbers to meet with the state's attorney's office and this is where if the state's attorney's office needs help, they could bring in planning staff or GIS or whoever has the data here to try to iron out some compromise on those figures so that we have something that we can collectively move forward on. I think I don't want this to delay the process of moving forward, because that was a concern about this committee, that if we get bogged down because we're arguing over a couple hundred people, that it stops the disbursements for other municipalities. But I think the concept that we would go forward with would be an allocation on a certain head count. We'd hold back some money, as Mr. Surges suggested, 10%. That's an issue we need to talk about here. Could be more than that to start with, but that would allow us to fine tune the population figures in those cities as well, because we would have that money available to do it with. So this is a complicated issue technically. I know we're going through a federal census count right now, but from where we were last week, I'd say we're 95% of the way there to have buy-in on this. And if we're willing to allow the municipalities that have questioned to work with our staff to come back with a recommendation, I think that may be in our best interest. Open up for Ms. Thomas.
The 5 municipalities that have objections, are they objections to the 2010 census numbers that we're proposing to use? Or are they simply saying, we want more current numbers?
I haven't spoken to them. This was after our meeting Monday. I asked Leslie to contact the membership. They got back to her initially. It was good news. Then there were some that raised questions. So I think with respect to at least 3 of them, they're saying that they feel they have a slightly more population than was indicated in the figures.
Well, I think all the municipalities could probably, or a majority can probably say that. So if it's just we want more current numbers, I don't think we can get into that. I mean, with the interest of time. I mean, if the majority, everyone except these five are saying, we
Well, one of
accept
the-
2010 census numbers, which are coming through CMAP.
Cliff, did you have a question?
I did. It's, question and a comment. The question being, the mayor's group that came forward, did they not have consensus among themselves when they moved this to us?
They had consensus to us to, as to certain issues. Number one, supporting the 45-55 split.
But not the count, the
Yeah.
census?
Number two, they had an agreement mutually that they wouldn't argue that one city's needs were more than others. So we didn't have to decide whether Hampshire has got a greater need than Huntley, for example. They agreed to the per capita approach. But it was an open issue with respect to census. I think initially they were buying into an original census number, and then Mark Armstrong came to us with a greater, significantly lower number for Aurora, and that's what caused us to go back and reevaluate the process. It's
Okay.
my understanding.
Okay, and then comment-wise, I love when I see these things. When Audrey and I got married in 1990 and moved to Gilbert's in my first run for public office, we had like 560 people in the town. That was it.
That's when you hammered in your signs on wooden stakes. and
Boom.
stapled, right?
And now to see that we're actually above East Dundee and just under West Dundee, at 8,000 plus is just incredible. What a run.
Mr. Sanchez?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. My first thought is that perhaps the municipalities that don't agree with the CMAP numbers should first contact CMAP staff maybe and just kind of get a sense of where they're getting those numbers from and see if the conversation can be struck up that way. I don't know if that would be appropriate or if it would be better for them to deal with our state's attorney's office. That's just my thought.
All right, can I ask, is there someone in the audience, Mayor Burns, you want to address the committee on the issue of how the census numbers changed? Because I was working under with the understanding the census wasn't an issue when we started.
No,
Then it became an issue.
I'm going to ask our Executive Director, Leslie Melendi, to join me as well,
Okay.
6 feet away. But
Sure.
the reality is this, folks. The original numbers we provided were based on that 2010. We returned to CMAP and asked them for numbers that included the estimated 2019 population. Based on that estimate, we asked our members, do you find this accurate or inaccurate, depending on the swing? Those communities who said, oh yeah, that's way off, have made that objection. CMAP will not make a stand to say, wait a minute, our numbers are right. They will leave that up to the individual communities. And of course, as you know, communities will pull building permits, what have you, to verify and validate. certain
Well,
numbers.
let me ask this question with respect to your group. Were they in agreement with the 2010 numbers?
Oh, gosh, no.
Okay. Because there was changes in population, significant increase.
Significant, yeah. We are in agreement with the 55-45 split.
Right.
Absolutely. We would recommend strongly that any reserve not come from the 45%, respectfully. And we would also respectfully dissent with regard to support of the fire districts coming from that 45% as well. But with respect to the numbers, those need to be hammered out individually. For example, Aurora and Elgin. I know Leslie's leading that charge.
Right, and St. Charles as well. And I've been in contact with the CMAP representatives, and they made it clear that these are the 2019 estimates.
Leslie,
So-
can you state your name for the?
Oh, I'm sorry,
minutes?
Leslie Melendi, Executive Director of Metro West Council of Government.
Okay.
And so these are just estimates that CMAP has been taking upon themselves from 2010 to current. And so some of them do not take into the fast-growing areas. And St. Charles is one of the ones that was questioning that, as well as Carpentersville. They believe they have some apartment buildings and bigger buildings that have not taken that into account. But overall, it's not a large number that's in dispute.
To Ms. Thomas's point, if Carpentersville comes in and through some technical analysis that's presented that may not have been taken into account in the CMAP numbers, they justify 500 more people or 300 more people. Do you expect pushback from Geneva, for example, of the fact that they would get a higher allocation population?
Not at all.
No.
The pushback is not between the communities. Any differential, we ask those communities to validate with this
Okay.
committee.
All right.
Right. Every town is signing off on the 2019 population estimate, and the ones that are in your packet that I've questioned it are the only ones that have not signed off and agreed to their numbers.
All right, so if we did some homework using the CMAP numbers, some interaction with the cities that are in question and came back with what would be something that was deemed to be a reasonable solution, and we submitted that back to your membership, you don't expect an objection?
No, I do not.
All right.
No. And most of them can prove their growth through building permits and other documentation that they already have within their city. So it shouldn't be difficult.
Mr. Surges?
John, could we, I mean, we're working as a team here. Is there
Right.
any, can we just give them a deadline to get back to us with their
Well,
numbers?
What I was going to suggest is that, you didn't know where we were last week. We didn't have any census numbers that we have buy-in on. Now we've got 95% of it done here by agreement. If we can have those municipalities work with our staff to come back and they circulate discussion between now and our next meeting, hopefully we'll have a final number. And I just want to make sure that everyone has no problem with that process. Is that, Ms. Thomas?
Yes, because my concern was just opening a can of worms and having everyone dispute the numbers, but if that's not the case.
Sure. Sir, please state your name for the record.
Sure. This is Dan Shulman, and I'm representing Aurora and Elgin, but Commissioner Thomas asked a good question. Just to respond quickly, the variation is very small. So like Elgin had a slight increase. They're saying about 1,000 people, but it's not like going to significantly change the numbers. And my understanding is the other municipalities don't have a problem. So it's not going to cause a major altering of the distribution.
All right, so we have relied on the organization that just presented to do a lot of, I don't want to say a lot of our work for us, but at least come as a unified body. And if we can continue to do that, it'll make that process a lot smoother. Mr. Frost?
I just have a question on the Aurora situation. As I understand it, Aurora municipal limits cover 4 counties. And I think I'm correct in saying 3 of those counties receive these funds. So are we only dealing with the King County portion of Aurora?
Yes.
And only the King County portion of population?
Correct.
Okay, thank you.
Elgin has a big Cook County population as well. I mean, other municipalities have smaller numbers, but yes, this is Kane County only.
Thank you.
All right, so with the consensus of the committee, we'll put this back on our agenda for our next meeting with the hope that we've made progress on the few that are out there and that we can get a final number we can buy off on. All right? Any questions of the commissioners here or the board members here? Or the board members at home or elsewhere? All right, thank you. All right, now moving on to our next item on the agenda, timing of distributions. I think we bought into the concept of having an application that we need to approve. Once we have an approved application, we also need to have the full board approve the 45-55 distribution. The timing of the distributions, I would expect would be available, and we would authorize the treasurer to make the disbursements as soon as we were satisfied that a local government application had been properly submitted. One of the, and contained the necessary documentation. Just to finish the thought that was raised by Mr. Surges, and Mayor Burns alluded to this, the reserve concept. We had discussed last month, and there were, I think, 3 different numbers thrown out. I believe, Cliff, you had suggested a 10% reserve. I think Mr. Hansen was suggesting at least the first wave of distribution as we get things finalized would be more in the area of 60%, which would be akin to a 40% reserve, although that would be with the understanding that after we got the process vetted properly, the other amount would be available shortly thereafter. And then I heard suggestions from another committee member that suggested somewhere in the area of 70%. As my hope was that we could get a resolution to the board tomorrow that would approve the 55-45 split and approve the distribution of up to, out of the 45% for the local government applicants, approve up to a certain percentage, a substantial percentage of the funds immediately upon receipt of a qualified application, with the understanding that the money that would be held back would not be for the purpose of punishing anyone or whatever, that would flow shortly thereafter. But it would give us time to get the census numbers figured out finally. It would give us time to deal with other issues that come in, give us a chance to take a look at the other application, the other municipal or local government applications, and have just a better feeling that, once the process is started, we can finish it in short order. Again, the goal is not to have these funds retained with the county for any longer a period of time than is necessary to properly vet the applications and make sure we finish the process. So what I wanted to talk about was this concept of what percent, I don't want to call it a holdback. I think what we're talking about is approving the concept of distribution with the first phase of funding to be a certain percent of that 45%. Mr. Sanchez?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm in favor of this idea. I think starting off with a 50-50, and I think of it as a first round, that's still $20 million, and the immediate expenses that municipalities have incurred can start to get reimbursed, and we can get a more accurate idea of, they can get a more accurate idea of where that money will go elsewhere, if anywhere else. I know there was the understanding that 100% of all payroll will be eligible, but that was kind of a technicality, and we understand now for sure that all expenses have to be COVID related. So the original number that was coming from Metro West municipalities is going to be a significantly smaller. So with $20 million, we've got more time, like you said, to iron out some of the other details, but then the municipalities can get a better picture of how the money will go. Because as we'll discuss, I'm sure in a little bit, we have a lot of ideas for how to spend our own share of the money, the 55%. And there might not be much, if anything, left for things like doing a small business grant from our end, for instance. And so that other 20 million, the municipalities may consider using for something like that, and just all these other details that we do have to figure out along the way. So I'm in favor of 50-50 for the first round, get it started right away, and then keep working on some of these finer points.
All right, Mr. Surgis?
John, I guess my fundamental question on it becomes, if there's a 45% distribution from the original 92, and a municipality, for whatever census numbers are used, winds up not being able to use all that, where does that money default back to? I'm assuming us, but I don't want to make that.
That assumes a couple facts that we haven't decided yet, but it was, there would be when we begin the application process, there'd be a period of time that the application process would be open, say 30 days, for example. Some local governmental entities may be ready to apply right now because they've done their homework. Whatever time frame we agree on would give them that time to apply. Once we have all the applications in, we'll be able to determine if there's money left over or money that the applicants didn't have a justification for use of. At that point, that's an ongoing process, and we're going to have to evaluate what to do with that. Comes back to us for further consideration.
Okay, and again, would that be available if Gilbert's didn't use it all? Could Carpentersville use some of their money, or does that default back to us? And then my second statement is, I don't want to hold this money. I don't mind holding back 10% for that what if. But I personally, I am not in favor of a 50-50. into multiple dispersions. If we agree on the 45%, hold back 10 for that what-if scenario that's available to them if we reach that deadline, but let's get them their money and let them do what they need to with it according to our guidelines that we're putting forth. That's
your-
just me.
Okay, on your first question, I think it's too early to decide whether Pingree Grove's money goes to
Yeah, I just don't know
another
how to figure that.
local governmental entity, but I think it essentially comes back, it's still in the county's fund, and then the county will decide what issues are in front of it at that time and make a decision as to which way it would go. Ms. Thomas?
So my apologies if this has already been addressed, but we're setting a deadline for all applications, correct? So we can have the complete picture in front of us?
That would be my expectation or recommendation that we do that.
Okay, and that would be a very tight deadline of like a week or so.
Well, I don't think it will be a
14
week.
days, something like that.
Well, I guess I'd want feedback from the local governmental groups. Mr. Rickard, Treasurer Rickard raised his hand. Do you have a comment?
Just to clarify that we in the Kane County for AP do a 2-week distribution. In other words, when you put in a payment, it takes about 2 weeks to process through the normal AP system. The next cutoff for that would be July 24th, which would mean we would get a payment out by August 3rd. I don't recommend doing it that way. What I recommend is a special run, which means we could get the money out within 24 to 48 hours, working with the auditor and the finance director at the discretion of the board. So that's a better option of the two options. And I just want you to make you aware that we can do that if that's the will of the committee.
Okay, I guess the question for the local governmental entities that are here today is what's a reasonable time frame to submit your application? Is it a 30-day process? Is it
2 weeks?
2 weeks?
Is that literally somebody's gum sitting on the railing?
Yeah, it's mine.
Is that yours, Jeff?
Mr. Chairman, we're happy to abide by whatever deadline you provide. We're ready to go.
All right.
So since we'll have all of the applications in front of us, I'm in agreement with my colleague, Mr. Surges. We should not hold this money. Maybe, I'm in favor of maybe 10% set aside for contingency, but otherwise I say release it.
Can I make a recommendation and then we can consider it? I know that there's some committee members that wanted a more substantial holdback, others. The bottom line is once we allocate the funds are available for their use. The issue is the timing of the distribution. Maybe a compromise at 75 or 80% would satisfy both concerns without having a huge difference as we deal with some technical issues. Mr. Hanson?
Certainly by now, it's my position that we should hold, excuse me, something back. And there may be local units of government that will not be able to find an immediate cost for their entire allocation. There's a real possibility that language may change in new legislation that may allow for lost revenues. I have no problems with getting as much as we can out to folks that have a need for their full allocation right now, but to hold some back, for lack of a better term, I think is a smart thing to do for not only the county, but for the local governments too.
Mr. Sanchez?
I think part of the nuances of this is, are we just handing them each a lump sum based on their per capita, or are they submitting their expenses as they go, and then it draws from their share of the money? Because I think depending on which route we take can help sway things a little bit. My understanding is that the most prudent way of doing this is to have them submit the expenses as we go, and we have a certain cap on how much they each get, and that's what we've been discussing. And again, I think with the taking out the 100% payroll option for emergency services, the actual asks of the municipalities are going to be much smaller. So that's just where I'm coming from. I'm more concerned about that really than if we hold back money or not. It's really just making sure that we're covering all our bases, and it's not just here's a bunch of money, spend it, try and spend it the best you can. I would rather us have a sort of a double protection. Where
I think if you read through the application, that you'll get, some of your questions will be answered because the detail is in there, and obviously we can modify that. I just, if someone's got expense worthy reimbursements, I think I guess the gist of what the board has told me is they want to get the funds out now if they can do it. So,
And John, Jaron, when I say get them the money out, if there is a community that doesn't meet their, it says, we just don't need it all. I
They
mean,
haven't made that community yet.
yeah, I mean, yay,
It's
but I don't
every day.
think that's there. I think they're all saying, we not only need it, but we needed it a month and a half ago. And that's my understanding, unless I'm somehow off base on this.
Can we agree on a 75% allocation?
The-
5%?
The 10% would be,
10%.
10% would be 90, so you're saying 75 now?
75 as
I mean,
opposed to 50.
I support the 90. I agree with Cliff.
Mr. Weber?
I'm not on the committee, but as a, obviously a board member that'll be, a part of all this, I like personally the 80-20 rule. Just from business practices that I'm a part of, it seems to work out really good. It's a good compromise from what other people on the committee want. So I like 80-20.
I have no problem with 80-20. I do like having a true second round, a second date, if you will, that may, frankly, it provides the opportunity to frankly roll out more. If we're finding a surplus within our 55% or other municipalities that say we don't need it, perhaps we alter what can go out in that second round. But
I think that raises an important point, and I think that, if we had a 5-year program, our planning could be much more deliberate. But when we talk about reserves, for example, I was thinking about this over the weekend, Cliff. We've got to have this money not only out the door, but it's got to be spent by December 31. So that mitigates against a larger contingency, but it also does point out, if we go on a streamlined application process and we get applications in and we find out that there's significant unallocated funds because the municipalities don't have the needs, then we can further our work and talk about either another process for them to deal with new developments, or we can reallocate it to other needs that we see deem appropriate. So I want to make sure that that's clear, because for those entities that are thinking, all right, now you're making us give a deadline here, we don't know what the expenses are going to be that are going to come up in the future. We at least have a framework to deal with that issue potentially. We discussed that. All right, so.
Mr. Chairman? Is that Doug Shefflow?
Hi, Doug. You have the floor.
Can I have a comment? Thanks. I guess I'm kind of missing what we're discussing. My number is less than 50%, but I see this as only being for the next 30 days till the next county board meeting. So I don't think we could spend 50% of this money or even get it out the door in 30 days between the application process, the IGA, working out the census information. Whatever number we come up with, our intention is to all 45% goes out the door once it's applied for, et cetera.
Now, the consensus of the committee is that 80% of it potentially could, knowing that as a practical matter, it'll be less than that.
Between tomorrow and the next county board meeting?
Potentially, yes. If that assumes we get an application that is approved and finalized, and we start and end an application process before then.
Okay, that's just seems like a lot to me, but it's only going to be 1 or 2 municipalities that are going to have those kind of expenses and have them all complete and issued. But so to me, the whole back is not critical.
One thing that's important, Doug, to recognize is that there's periodic reporting that has now become required of us to the state and federal government about our uses of funds. I think there was a report that was due a day, like within the last week, that we had to send out, if I understood the requirements correctly. Our report shows that we haven't distributed a penny yet. And I think they're, part of the reason for that reporting is to see if we're doing our job. So to the extent we're doing this in an intelligent fashion, I think it assists us in our reporting process and compliance that we do show we're putting the money to work.
I mean, if we get this money out in August, that's only 120 days until
Left
the end of
before we can
November,
do it
before
again.
Thanksgiving.
Right.
That's not a lot of time, guys. I don't want to be holding this money expecting.
That's
I-
right.
I mean,
Doug's comments well taken, but I think the consensus of the committee right now is 80-20. Mr. Davis, do you have the floor?
Oh, thank you, Mr. Chairman. You know, there seems to be consensus on the 55-45 split. The allocation to everybody, that determination seems to have a little bit of, flux in it, but small enough that were we to do a 10% contingency, as Mr. Surgis has suggested, and I support that idea, that would be more than enough to deal with those, relatively modest changes. I don't want to see us have any, project any kind of a position of micromanaging these funds for the people we're going to disperse them to. And it does seem to me that time is of the essence. I believe it would be best to, do the contingency and then apply the 45-55 split so that you can do the math. And in conjunction with the IGAs, say to everyone, here's your number. You may now apply for up to that total amount and let them go about the task of doing it, knowing that somewhere in that IGA, it will require of them to, do all of the necessary reporting and justify their expenses at some point later or be liable for it. Because we have then the remaining 55% that we have to get to work on in terms of allocating and spending. So I would rather do this process just the one time if possible.
All right, Mark, your point's well taken, but we've got a meeting tomorrow, hopefully, which we're going to have action at. We've had one camp says 50% or 60%, another says 90. I think Mr. Weber's proposed a reasonable compromise at 80. Can you live with that for tomorrow? And then knowing that we're going to be aggressive moving on going forward?
Absolutely. I mean, I can live with any of them. My point is just that anything other than allowing them to apply for up to 100% of their allocation number means you're going to do the process more than once.
Right.
So, once, if you've decided that that's going to, how we're going to approach it, whether it's 70, 75 or 80% really doesn't matter anymore. At that point, you're going to do the process.
I don't think we're requesting multiple applications. If an applicant had justification for 100% of their funds, they'd be eligible for disbursement of 80% now, with 20% at a date we determine later. So I don't think we're going to have to go through the process again, but we can talk about this.
Okay.
Okay, later. All right, so if I understand the consensus of the committee, then the two items would be the 55-45 and with an 80-20 availability for disbursement at this point.
I would suggest the 90-10. Call your vote. Vote me down. I don't, I think 90-10 is appropriate.
All right, so I've been dealing with consensuses, but does someone want to make a motion to approve an 80-20 split? Mr. Kenyon moves, Mr. Frost seconds. Please call the roll.
Hanson,
Yes.
Kenyon,
Yes.
Roz,
Yes.
Sanchez,
Yes.
Surges,
No,
Thomas.
Yes.
Passes.
you have consensus.
Shay.
Great, thank you. You made your point. Okay, so next item, we talked about the staff requirements. Kane County Share Unincorporated, we talked about that going to the Development Committee. That committee can begin its work and application as soon as it's ready. Discussion on the balance of the funds, and this really ties into two separate issues. The 55%, we began discussion on those issues yesterday or was it yesterday? I can't remember when the executive committee is. I lost my track of days since yesterday was Sunday. Of
Friday.
course, it was Friday, the last business day anyway, where staff and office elected officials made presentations as to potential county uses. I would just say in terms of the new business resolutions, we can talk about that. But I think we need to have committee meetings dedicated, once we, we create the line where 55% of the funds are available, then we go ahead and then we have the analysis done, with the exception of maybe the health department that's got the most urgent need that's apparent at this point. But I do want to discuss one concept, and again, I see this program headed in a direction that it was going to head, whether there was debate or not. But I think one major task that this committee is accomplishing is the framework within which we administer it. And one of the discussions that I've heard comments about from a number of board members is the potential for small business grants and allocating some portion of the funds for that. Those funds could come out of the 55%. They may come out of the 45% that goes to the municipalities. But to the extent that the county was going to consider a small business grant program, which I personally would favor if we have funds available. We do have, again, to not reinvent the wheel, we do have neighboring counties that have plans in place. In fact, Lake County is currently accepting applications for their program. They have, I believe the criteria there may be a business that's got less than $2.5 million in revenue and less than a certain number of employees. And I'm sorry, the grant cap was $30,000 per business in Lake County. I believe DuPage County has small business grants. I'm not sure if Cook County does or not, but what I'd like at least to be able to do is to direct our staff to, in this case, the state's attorney's office, to research the framework for those programs so that if we ever choose to do it, we can have the skeleton in place to move forward and we can have the program ready to go. Again, that's not a commitment to fund that program, but if we agree, someone comes up with the idea to do this and we pass it 60 or 90 days from now or 30 days from now, then we have to go back to the drawing board to set up the program. So to the extent we can share information with our other counties, I wanted to get the consensus of the committee to task our state's attorney to do that research for us. Mr. Fraz?
Yeah, I agree completely. That was one of the items I was going to bring up. And I guess the other thing is, the 45% we're distributing to the municipalities, do we require that a percentage of that be earmarked for small business? Do we leave it entirely up to them? I had a conversation with the mayor of Campton Hills. I know that may be their largest line item. And I do like the 2.5 million gross sales cap. If you look at the Small Business Administration, their definition of a small business is 500 employees or under, which I think most people would think of as a big business. And one of the federal programs that came out was just, completely wiped out by fairly large businesses. So I would really encourage us, and I like the Lake County proposal that it starts at the bottom and looks after the smaller business. So yeah, I'm behind it 100%.
Right, with any program like that, though, your comments make this point, and that is, it's not just we create a program and put it in place. There are parameters that are policy decisions. What's the size of the business, the number of employees, the limit on the grant, whether it's exclusive of other grants, or what if you got a grant for PPP and you've expended those funds and the grant period goes beyond that, do they qualify? Those are all, we could have one meeting that would deal with that concept, but at least if we have the skeleton of the program in place, or at least identified, that will help us move forward with that.
If you remember our debate on video gambling, there's not a big population of businesses in the unincorporated areas.
Right.
That's why most of us, or all of us, are in favor of distributing money to the municipalities. But I think there should be a requirement that, because for the same reason, most of our businesses are in municipalities that we encourage or require that the money received, some of it goes into a certain small business relief program.
Ms. Thomas?
I'd just like to say that the city of Aurora is already leading the way with respect to providing assistance to small businesses. And so I'm sure they'd be glad to share their guidelines for their program. And I just want to put something else on the radar for us, which we've discussed previously, and that's assistance to nonprofits, especially those that are addressing the most basic needs of our county residents. You know, one thing that should be very apparent is that it is not going to be business as normal even next year because of the significant financial hit all of the county and the municipalities and cities are experiencing. And so, you know, one thing we need to really prepare ourselves for is perhaps an increase in homelessness. And I know that we've received a letter from Hesed House. I fully expect to hear from someone directly before, you know, during this process. But, you know, while it's situated in Aurora, Hesed House serves the Fox Valley. And, you know, we need to provide adequate housing and services for those who are already in process with Hesed House. But unfortunately, they may be serving more people as a result of the financial impact of this pandemic. And so when it comes up, I hope that my colleagues will recognize that this is a much needed service for the whole county. It's situated in Aurora, but we serve the whole county.
That raises just an interesting point, because I've been contacted by nonprofit organizations, and I know there's probably not many nonprofit organizations that don't serve a substantial need in the county. And at Riverboat Committee, we have to fight through deciding whose charitable needs are more important than others. And we've done that, I think, in a pretty fair way over the years. But in this instance, we put ourselves in that same position. I'm not saying it's inappropriate. Lazarus House is in St. Charles. We have a substantial homeless facility there. I think what's different for them this time around is, at least I know at Hesed House, they had to relocate their people out of the facility to, I think, a hotel setup or some different housing arrangement because of the nature of the virus. So those are all discussions that have merit, and I think we can deal with those at a subsequent meeting. And we're going to have to come up with a way to deal with it, because whether it's the food pantries, the elder care centers, the homeless shelters, they all have qualified needs. So we'll have to deal with that with our resources.
Don, most of the not-for-profits I've spoken with, including the Chamber of Commerce, Boys and Girls Clubs, stuff like that, they've all been very honest in saying, we're not affected right now yet.
Right.
But our fundraisers go on through the summer. And when you count on that golf outing to be your big one, and there is no golf outing, we won't feel this until the fall going into winter. And they've been very candid about it. And they said, unfortunately, we don't even know what a virtual fundraiser is going to look like for us. So, and Drew, I'm in support 100%.
All right, so with no objection, I'll move forward. It will ask the state's attorney's office to research the framework for small business grants or similar programs, so we have that structure to deal with if we choose to move forward with it. Mr. Hanson?
Just to echo a couple sentiments there, I think we've been using the G word, which is the right way to go. I don't think we should get into the banking business and create small business loans. I think grants are the way to go. That's my opinion. I do like putting the extra energy into supporting smaller business, and how you define that shouldn't take very long. That's an easy working meeting, and we certainly have enough other counties around us and around the nation that we can mimic what they're doing or take their good ideas. When it comes to the aid for non-for-profits, amen, amen, and amen. And I hope that we can put energy to support those, especially supporting those that are either struggling with housing or hunger instabilities and insecurity. Saying non-for-profit creates a big category, but you've been able to vet things with riverboat grants before. But I do hope that in our 55% allocation that we will do things to support small biz and the appropriate non-for-profits.
All right, Mr. Sanchez.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I think something that's important to have as context in this conversation when we're talking about small business grants, helping nonprofits, it's how much the county is planning to spend of their 55%. And we just received a document at 12:45 today, so not much time to digest it, but Mr. Onzik sent out his estimates of expenditures eligible for reimbursement, and it's pretty much a chart showing you what he estimates we've already spent to date on COVID eligible reimbursement stuff, and the estimates going towards the end of the year. And what he's showing us right now is a pretty big number, total eligible being $36 million. And that's just what he's calculated. It has nothing, it's not reflective of, for instance, the resolutions today. And those resolutions, I mean, they total, I forgot where I wrote it down here, but a lot. 13 million for the health department. That's tomorrow, obviously, but that's something that we have to consider. That's coming from our 55%. 5 million for encrypted radio. IT, we have the three main projects that Roger will discuss at about 11.3, and then that fiber optic for underserved is 8 million, $1.5 million for elections. So we get into some pretty big numbers that go well over the $51 million that we're going to be figuring out what to do with,
That we
just
have to
based on.
prioritize them.
Yeah, so it's just
Yeah,
some
I'm
context.
encouraged by the fact that we received that breakdown from Mr. Onzik's office. I was unaware that it was issued, so of course I was on the phone most of the time all weekend. But we can take that into account when this committee or the board as a whole gets that information when we talk about the 55%. All right? So, all right, going on to new business, we have a number of resolutions that were sent to us. I would say consistent with that thought, we have the recommendation for, I'm going to skip down here. I'm not, one is the second one is the IT department. The third is the presentation for public health and safety. The fourth is sheriffs. And the fifth is, again, public safety. And the sixth is county clerk. I did receive a call from the county clerk today. They indicated that they're still in the process of evaluating their expenses. They'll know more as we get closer to the election. But I'd entertain a motion to table all these resolutions to a future meeting of this committee so we can sort those out with the information Mr. Onzik gave us before this meeting. Mr. Kenyon moves, Mr. Frost seconds. Any discussion?
Can't discuss on the table. Can't discuss on
No
the table.
discussion at the table.
Discussion. Hearing none, all those in favor say aye.
Aye.
A roll call, sorry.
Hanson.
Aye.
Kenyon.
Aye.
Braz.
Yes.
Sanchez.
Yes.
Burgess.
Yes.
Thomas.
Yes.
And then Hoshay.
Okay, yes. Motion carries. Now back to the first item, which is a resolution for allocation and distribution of the CARES Act. I think this is the open item that the chairman mentioned at the executive committee meeting, where we would advance our recommendation, which we could amend, I suppose, on the floor tomorrow to fill in the blanks because it's on the committee. If I understand it, the consensus of the committee would be, as it relates to that motion to, or that resolution, to approve the 45-55 allocation and also to allow for the 80-20 allocation as well. Is there anything else that,
Subject to your three packets.
pardon?
Subject to,
Oh, yeah, subject to the, properly received application and intergovernmental agreement, of course. So is there a motion to move that on to fill in the blanks on our resolution? Mr. Surgis, second by Mr. Kenyon. Any discussion? Ms. Thomas?
What additional facts or, information do we need to include? Do we need to take into consideration what Auditor Hunt told us about the approval process, or?
I think that'll that'll be covered by the clause that'll deal with the issue of properly documented intergovernmental agreement. The intergovernmental agreement will provide requirements for documentation as the expenditures are made.
Okay.
Barb,
So
I'm sorry.
if passed tomorrow, as soon as we get the application approved, then we're good to go with accepting applications, approving. That's all that's needed.
And then they have to be submitted and then through our vetting process, correct?
Okay.
Ms. Wonicky?
John, as long as we're talking about applications, just so I'm clear, will all applications go to the state's attorney's office, or do the applications for the fire districts servicing unincorporated areas?
Everything would be funneled through the state's
Everything
attorney's
goes,
office.
and then he forwards it over to development.
Correct.
Okay,
Or
got it.
if development's not needed for
Mhm.
input, but yes.
Say that again?
It would all be centralized at the state's attorney's office. They would have a roster of applications and would make sure that all the compliance matters are dealt with.
Okay, and that moves on from there. Okay, thank you.
Mr. Hanson?
Will there be a centralized request process for our department heads and our departments here within the county? It may not be critical for tomorrow's resolution, but we've seen presentations. Some have had very firm and very absolute asks, and some, like the clerk's office, may have increased costs and things will become clear down the line, but is there going to be a centralized process for that?
I would expect that once we get over the hurdle that is set up for tomorrow, then that will follow, because we're going to want the list of all requests so that whether it's this committee or whatever committee the board chooses, can allocate what we're going to do with the 55%. And it would make sense to set up a time frame for those requests, just as Ms. Thomas indicated, because, you know, the sooner the better. Because we have budget issues to deal with. To the extent that those funds will reimburse us for some budgeted expenses, it'll avoid budget adjustments at the end of the year. All right. Pardon, we have a motion and a second. Okay, call the roll, please.
Yes.
Kenyon?
Yes.
Braz?
Yes.
Sanchez?
Yes.
Sturgis? Thomas?
Yes.
And motion.
Yes, okay. Motion passes. All right, any other business for the meeting today? Mr. Fraz?
I just have a couple of clarifications, if you don't mind. As far as the fire districts, where did we leave off on that as far as would a fire district just apply for one grant, whether it's covering municipal or rural areas? And that, would that go to the county? Do we still need to talk about it?
I guess the concept that we at least understood was the fire districts would provide their information to the municipality. The municipality would include the portion that the fire district covers within the municipality in their request. And then the fire district, with respect to their unincorporated area, would submit it to the Mr. Martin's committee for making the municipal requests.
Okay, so I guess then that leads to, we have to assume that the municipalities will be willing to work with the fire
Right,
district.
if they're not, they can point it out to us and we'll do it. My understanding all along is that was an assumption I made that may be incorrect, but if it isn't, we're going to get it right one way or another, all right? If there's someone that doesn't get included in the municipal request, then we'll deal with it in a different way.
And then my second clarification, as far as the disbursement process, we would receive the request, they'd be approved. The treasurer then could disperse the funds. Maybe our auditor would like to speak, or what's his role going to be in this? At what point does the auditor approve or disapprove of what we're doing?
Maybe what we can do on that, Drew, I don't know if we have an answer, but there is some, obviously with substantial sums of money like this, work that we have to do. What I would suggest is for our next meeting, we have a line item on there that is disbursement procedures, and between now and then the state's attorney's office can work with the auditor's office and the treasurer to talk about the process of distribution. And Mr. Rickards' point about expediting the payment, it was really appreciated. I think that's really the goal of this committee. And so we can work on that system between now and then.
Thank you.
right, any other questions or comments? Mr. Hernandez?
Sitting in the wrong seat.
Yeah, I'm sorry.
When will the next meeting be?
All right, that's the final business. I would suggest, if possible, and I know it's been an issue for us, but if we could have a meeting next Monday again, just to get through tomorrow, and then hopefully then we could spread these out a little bit, but we could get going on some of the other issues in the meat of what we're dealing with on the county side. So is there, yes, or next Monday, Board of Review here? Could we meet at the same time the Board of Review's meeting? Roger, is that possible or not? If, I've got a meeting at 3 o'clock on Friday or Monday that I can't get out of, so we could either do it early afternoon on Monday, or we could do it in the morning on Monday. What's the pleasure of the committee?
Morning.
Would morning work?
Morning.
Okay. Could we make it earlier?
Really? What time, Roger, would
5.
be early?
Anytime after 5.
Could we,
So 5,
is
that'll-
8:30 a problem? 8:30?
8?
Well, I do it at 6 in the morning, but we have issues with staff here. The building's not open, but
I can make it.
I'd set off the alarm. I wouldn't want to do that. So how about if we set 8:30 on Monday morning for our committee? Is that okay? All right, if there's no further business, I'll entertain a motion to adjourn. Mr. Froz moves, Mr. Kenyon seconds. We need a roll call. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Opposed? We are adjourned. Thank you for being here.
John, Monday, the 20th at 8:30 a.m.
Correct.